a lot to be uncovered here. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cases, and perhaps you know some of these people. Could be, they've come and spoken to this group, but let me, just tell you about a few. So there's a woman in the book who came back with musical ability. Her name, she asked me if she could go by a pseudonym, and so her name is Marissa in the book. And Marissa was a documentary producer and writer in Canada. And she was, your typical millennial generation person who was very driven by success, finding a guy, being successful, being at the top of her field, making a lot of money. And she was also anorexic. She died, she had her NDE, she died and had an NDE while she was on a film shoot in Belgium. She left her body, she went to the out-of-body, she went to a chapel on the site of where they were filming this, and she looked down from the ceiling of the chapel, and she thought, it's so peaceful here, I'd like to just lie down. But she thought, I can't do that because everyone will look at me. And then, still out of body, she returned back to her bedroom, and she looked down and said, didn't know who was on the bed. She said she had no association with, it was her, but she had no association with that body. It could have been a chair or a piece of furniture. She had an experience out in the universe where she was told, given all the answers to everything, philosophy, mathematics, all types of science, music, art, and she was told that the answer is simplicity. So she was given the choice if she was going to stay or come back, and she decided to come back. So the first year that she was back, she didn't tell anybody what happened. She had a lot of difficulty adjusting. After a year, she went to visit a friend of hers, and her friend's girlfriend had a harp. And Marissa didn't play the harp, she didn't play any instrument. But every day when her friend would go to work, Marissa would go and get this harp and take it outside and play. And so, she had, every day her friend would go to work and she would do this. And she wondered what was she going to do when she went back home because she didn't have a harp. And she said, well, I'll give myself 2 weeks. And if I still have this desire after 2 weeks, I'll figure it out then. So she went home. She waited the 2 weeks, and she said she still had this need for the harp, and she described it as a physical need. And she said she recognized the sign of the harp, the vibration of the harp. She recognized that vibration and that sound. She said it was a very loving sound. It was a sound she heard in her NDE. So she said this was a physical need. She had to have this harp. So she, I think, went on Craigslist, and she found a harp. But it was $2,000. She was in communication with the person selling it, but it was $2,000, and she didn't have the $2,000. So she got a call the next day from a production company, and they said, did you get the check? And she said, well, you already paid me. This was for a production she'd already done. And they said, well, no, we still owe you. There's still a check coming. It's for $2,000. You knew that was coming, right? So she got, she took her check, excuse me. She took the check for $2,000 and she went and got the harp. She brought it back to her apartment and sat it in the living room and stared at it because she had no training. She didn't know what she was going to do with it. So every day she would go online and she would Google harp. And nothing much was showing up until one night, late at night, she looked at the page, and all the way down at the bottom of the page it said harp thanatology. Do you all know what that is? No. That's someone who's a harpist who plays bedside for hospice patients. So she said when she looked at that, she knew what she was supposed to do. And she said it was now all beginning to make sense. So she had to find a teacher, and she found a school in Philadelphia that teaches harp thanatology. But again, she didn't have the money. Well, the next thing that happened was she got a refund from the IRS. She'd never gotten a refund in her life, and she got a refund from the IRS for the exact amount of this class. So she went to this class in Philadelphia, and the first thing the teacher said was, this work is all about simplicity. So today, Marissa is a harp thanatologist. She's no longer a producer or writer. And she, like many other people, her energy came back altered. I think we don't know exactly in what way, but many of these people, everybody comes back with an after effect. Not everybody comes back with the same. And oh, by the way, when I talk to people, they'll say to me, they get kind of ashamed, and they'll say, I didn't come back with any special skill. Not everybody comes back with a special skill. Everybody comes back altered in some way, but not everybody comes back with a special skill. So I want to disavow that. And also, many people said to me, I didn't go through the tunnel, so I guess my experience wasn't valid. Again, there's been so much emphasis on the elements of the NDE that, people have now had it like drilled into them that, you must have experienced these certain elements or it's not valid. Not true. So the way IANDS and ASSIST define whether or not you've had an NDE is if you come back transformed, unable to go back to your former life. So, let me talk about another case, Robert Barr. Did anybody know who Robert Barr is? I don't think he's spoken here. So he's a former policeman. He worked in South Central LA. He worked in Berkeley, the riot squads. He gassed people and beat people. He was not a very nice guy. And he had a physical. He checked out. Everything was great. He got on a plane to visit his son in Phoenix, and he spent a lovely week visiting his son in Phoenix. And his son drove him to the airport at the end of the stay. And Robert said his goodbyes and thanked him. And he said he went into the airport, and he just wasn't feeling well. But he said, according to him, he John Wayne'd it through the airport, and as soon as he got on the plane, he dropped dead. Now, there were paramedics on the plane, and they revived him. When he was out of body, he saw what his colleagues had to say about him behind his back. He saw a lot of things that weren't very nice, and he came back and he said, "I only want to do good. I never want to be in that position again, and I only want to do good." So today, he's a not-for-profit grant writer. He lives in Oregon, and one of the nicest people I've ever met. Just a lovely, lovely person. But his eyesight changed. So, now remember, he had a physical before his NDE. He had his vision checked and everything. So before his NDE, his vision was 20/90. And then afterwards, it was 20/10. And the reason he knew it was 20/10 was because he was on a program on the Discovery Channel about NDEs. And, they want to vet everybody to make sure they don't, everybody's real. So, he had to have a physical at that point. And so his eyesight improved from 20/90 to 20/10, better than perfect vision. And it's been 5 years and it's still going strong. And I've spoken to a number of people whose eyesight has improved. So that, for some people has been an after effect. There's another individual in the book, Ken Ebert, whose hearing improved. Now, this is kind of a funny story. Anybody here know who Penny Sartori is? Penny Sartori. So Penny Sartori wrote a book with Pim Van Lommel, who endorsed my book. And Penny was a nurse in the UK for many years, and I believe worked in the ICU, and would see people pass, and heard lots of stories. And she eventually wrote a book about near-death experiences. And she and I were in communication when I was writing my book. So she said to me one day, she said, I know of a man who has the kind of after effects that you're interested in, and here's his website. So I went to his website, and there was a picture of him on the website, and I looked at it, and I said, oh my God, he's the cashier at Sid's. Anybody know Sid's? Who's been in Taos? Oh, right, Sid's, the grocery store, right. It's sort of the little Whole Foods of Taos. So he was the cashier there. I knew him. So, and I contacted him, and he was like, yeah, I recognize you, and, I recognize him. So you know, here I had to find him through Penny in the UK, but his hearing improved. So he was in an accident. He had his NDE when he was in a bicycle accident in his teens, and he had a fairly extensive out-of-body experience and pretty extensive trauma as well. But when he came back from his NDE, he moved to Boston, and this is when he first realized that there was something going on that was unusual with his hearing. He came back from work one day, and he heard this very high-pitched sound, and he went around the apartment trying to locate the source of it, and he finally found it coming from a box in the closet. It was his alarm system, but it hadn't been armed yet. So, he was already picking up these other sounds. And then he found when he went to Taos and he was working at Sid's that he could hear conversations at the back of the store. It's a pretty big store. So he could hear conversations down the street, he could hear conversations in the back of the store. So, that was his after effect. There's in the book, There's a story about a woman who came back and her IQ went from 123 to 145, which is Mensa level. And she had an NDE in childbirth. So, so there are many of these stories in the book. All the people said the same thing to me. I feel different. I don't feel like myself anymore. I'm not myself anymore. Usually their families didn't recognize them. They didn't recognize themselves. So now I want to talk about a couple other things that came up in the research that were interesting. So when I read for these people, I told them, they could all ask questions in the reading as well. I had my list of questions, but they could ask questions as well. And so they all had two questions. They had many questions, but they all had two of the same questions. And the first one was, why me? And the second one was, what's my mission? And they always said mission. They never said, like, should I go back to school? Or, what kind of job should I have? They'd always say, what's my mission? Because they all felt they had something greater to accomplish. Now, many of them had been given a mission and they knew what it was, and those were the lucky people. But there were a lot of other people who knew they had a mission, but darned if they could figure out what it was. And so, many people, who've had these experiences go off in search of their mission, and sometimes, they're peripatetic, and they'll go from place to place thinking, it's around this corner, maybe if I go over there, I'll find it there. So, the issue is, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, so, the changes that people, the transformations that they come back with, in many cases are not suited to our earth. People come back from these experiences with one foot in the universe and one foot on earth, and the universe seems to have an idea in mind for these people, but the problem is, we live here, we live in a three-dimensional world that, runs a certain way. It's not run exactly the same way as the universe. So it's very difficult to adapt because you're neither fish nor fowl. So again, for the people who know what their missions are, and for people in particular who have a mission that is translatable to something on Earth, music, high vibration activity, art, again, there's a certain amount of vibration that goes on there because people can stand in front of the art and, feel the effect of it. So, if it translates to something that is part of our system, it's a lot easier, but for, healing, but it's not that way for everyone. But anyway, people asked about mission. They also, hold on a second. So they, one thing that came up, and this may be something that you all have discussed here, was, predisposition for NDEs. I did readings on these people, and after a number of readings, I realized I was starting to get the same information for a lot of people. And it's a tricky thing because for those of you who do readings, sometimes you have to be careful how you say things and what you ask, if you have to follow up on something that you see. But I was seeing, for a lot of folks that many of them had difficult childhoods. Many of them had been abused. And so I would ask them, if this was something that happened to them, and they would say yes, or they would say, I try to forget about it, or I used to go into a tunnel, and, when this would happen, and so it seemed as if this kind of greased the wheels for their experience. And it seems as if, this background of abuse is somehow connected with an NDE. So that was something that came up. The other thing that, and there were some other elements that were linked to people who had had these experiences. One thing, as I said before, is many of them said, I always felt different. I always felt like I didn't belong. Many of them would spend a lot of time wondering about what's out there, and go outside and stare at the stars at night. Anybody here do that? I thought so. So, yeah, there seems to be some sort of link, maybe we come from the stars, but, there are a certain number of things that people who have these experiences seem to have in common. And, and then the question came up, well, are they manifesting their NDEs? It seems as if in some cases people outright asked for the experience, and in other cases people were on a path, so they were almost in training for the experience. So, perhaps a few years before or some years before, they were becoming more spiritual, or they were practicing yoga, or they changed their diet. Things were already starting to shift. Now, I don't know about you, but, NDEs have become really popular. And I get emails for all kinds of classes and workshops, and now I'm seeing classes on how to have an NDE. Which I don't really think that's, William James said, nobody can bring these on, and if they say they can, they're lying. So, you cannot, in my opinion, take a class to have an NDE. This seems to be very much in the hands of the universe. These events happen at a time that the universe decides. You may well be on the path, but there seems to be an exquisite moment when your consciousness is flung out of your body, either through trauma or through some other experience, and everything coincides, and and you have this experience. And it seemed as if it happened to these people that many of them were kind of going along for a period of time where things weren't working. They had bumpy lives. And things just weren't working, and maybe they tried this, they tried that, and they just couldn't. It was like I was often shown a car, stuck in mud, with the wheels spinning, and they were stuck in mud. No matter what they did, they couldn't get out of that rut. So it seems as if the universe lets some of these folks go on for a certain period of time, and then the universe steps in and says, "Okay, that's enough, now's the time." So it just, based on the readings I did, based on the stories that I heard, it seems as if this is very much orchestrated by the universe. And, the question was, so what's the universe thinking? What do they have in mind here? And what we came up with, to the best of my ability and through these readings, was that the universe seems to want to create lots of people who can come back and light the earth, who can be pillars of light for the earth. And, there are millions and millions and millions of people around the world who have these experiences. Many of them fall by the wayside. Not everyone is a Marissa, not everyone is a Bob Negriso. Some of them fall by the wayside. And I think that's part of the intent too. But I believe that the intent is to bring them back here to act as pillars of light. And they're fervent about it. They are fervent about it, and they are compulsive. People who come back just demonstrate compulsivity. They cannot stop themselves. Their behavior is compulsive. They are, it's just something that comes with it. And I believe that it's driven by, part and parcel by this energy that they return with. So, it's all very interesting. There's much more work that needs to be explored. I would, again, invite those of you who have an interest, to take the ball and run with it. You know, I think that there's more to the NDE than I went through the tunnel and I saw the light. You know, I think those are the elements, and I understand why science focuses on it, because science is driven by statistics. So, you know, they're not gonna do a reading on someone because that's not what they're trained for. But, you know, if they find that so many people went through a tunnel or saw a light, then that has meaning for them. But there's more to the experience than going through the tunnel or the light. Some people have very rich experiences and never went, you know, don't remember any of the elements. So, let me see, I think I'm gonna stop and take questions. Yeah, I'm gonna stop and take questions. The book is, you know, obviously for sale out there. I just wanna say something about the price. The reason I asked about the price is I used to be in the investment business. So I can't help myself. You know, curious how you arrive at pricing. So, anyway, so authors don't make any money. You know, I've been accused of, you know, you must make a lot of money off of this. I don't know, those of you who are authors know, you don't, this is a labor of love. Forget it. You don't make any money. So, but I was happy, you know, I was driven to write this book. I was driven to write it. Somebody wanted me to write it. I'd written a couple other manuscripts before this one. This was not the one I thought that was going to get published. But again, the universe had another idea in mind. For those of you who picked up, there's a table out in the lobby with some literature on it, and there's this article that was in the Huffington Post about me a few months ago, and they were asking me how I became an author, and I told them, you know, I'd written some other manuscripts, and then I wrote this one, and I was just inundated with offers from publishers. So, because there was, well, I'm not sure all the reasons, but there was interest in it, and it was so crazy because you don't have to have an agent to publish a nonfiction book, because there are a lot of publishers who publish nonfiction without an agent. But I had to go out and get an agent because I was so flooded with, I had unsolicited contracts coming in. So I had to get an agent, and it was just unusual. So anyway, this is an article not specifically about spirituality, but, you know, just kind of an interesting story.